Welcome. This panel is entitled The Next 300, Telling New Stories About New Orleans and Its Past. I am Mary Niall Mitchell, also known as Molly Mitchell. I co-direct the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies at UNO, where I'm a history professor there. And so I'm going to introduce the panel quickly and then give my own little brief introduction to this discussion. But the key word here is discussion. We want to discuss together. We're looking forward to having this conversation amongst the panel and also with the audience. So let me introduce our panelists first. And I will be going in order from here to there. Lane Kaplan-Levenson is the host and producer of WNO's history podcast, Tripod, New Orleans at 300. She was formerly the station's coastal producer. Lane also runs a live storytelling series called Bring Your Own and has had work featured on NPR, Marketplace, Latino USA, Backstory, Here and Now, and more. Sue Mobley, to Lane's right, is Public Programs Manager at the Small Center for Collaborative Design at Tulane School of Architecture and Director of Advocacy at Collocate Design. Her primary research interests are in urban studies, public history, and design ethnography with a focus on race, class, and gender. Mobley holds a Bachelor of Arts from Loyola University, New Orleans in anthropology and a Master of Arts in political science from the American University in Cairo. She's author of Human Rights, Human Wrongs, Observation of Human Rights Law and Norms in United Nations Peacekeeping Operations. And then finally, on the end, Dr. Elizabeth Seeby is Associate Professor of English at the University of New Orleans, specializing in Southern literature, New Orleans regional literature, multi-ethnic American literature, and gender and sexuality studies. She's co-editing A People's Guide to New Orleans with Linnell Thomas. She has recently published articles on radical intimacy in the era of Jim Crow fascism, biopolitics, and disaster management of the 1927 Mississippi River flood, and the autobiographical narratives of political prisoners. She also co-coordinates a creative writing and literacy program for women incarcerated at the Orleans Parish Prison. So please welcome our panel. And I should say, in all honesty, I work in various ways with all three of these women. So it's one of the reasons I wanted us to come together and have a discussion this year at the festival, because I like these kinds of opportunities to discuss these topics. So I just want to say a few words to get us started. I would say we are in a moment in this city right now. Yes, it's the tricentennial, which is an occasion to look backwards, but also forwards. And those of us who study the city's history recognize the tricentennial as an opportunity. It's a chance for us to engage the public in thinking about New Orleans' past and hopefully to uncover new stories, or maybe stories that people don't know as well, or those that have been forgotten, or even those that have been silenced in favor of stories that more politically powerful storytellers wanted to tell. But this moment we're in, I think, is actually bigger than the tricentennial, and if you've just been attending other panels at this festival, you know that this sort of political moment that we're in is infusing everyone's conversations. So it's a national moment, a cultural moment, with its roots in multiple social movements: Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, the Women's March, Me Too, and of course, who could forget after yesterday, Never Again. And these are movements that are questioning power, its misuse, and the narratives that the powerful so often tell. Take 'em Down NOLA's activism and Mayor Landrieu's removal of 4 Confederate monuments placed our city sort of at the center of this national movement and at the forefront of the effort to change the stories we tell about ourselves. So it's in the spirit of new narratives that this panel sits here today. And as an aside, not really an aside, but if you were lucky enough to see Kara Walker's Calliope during Prospect 4, I don't know how many people got to see that, which was on Algiers Point, located where in what had been an embarkation site for enslaved Africans. And she mentioned in her she produced a little pamphlet that went with it, and then some of the press that she gave. She said, the only thing that marks this site is a cheap brass plaque, right? True, right? I also, I guess, being someone that works in public history in New Orleans, took it as a bit of a criticism, but also really made me think about the people on this panel and all of the exciting work that they are doing in this city right now that will be coming to light. It's a very exciting time to be working in public history in this city. So on that note, I would like to start posing questions to the panel, and I'm just going to let them talk. But they each have a little presentation of their own to sort of show you sort of introduce you to the work that they're doing, and then we can discuss. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Lane.
Thank you, Molly, and good morning, everyone. As Molly mentioned, I produce the public radio show Tripod, New Orleans at 300, and it's also a podcast, and this is the first time that the radio station WWNO here in New Orleans has done anything like this, and like this in a lot of ways. One, just the fact that it's not only a program that airs and broadcasts on the FM frequency, it's also something that is put out in other mediums. So every single episode that we produce airs in the morning and then goes online, and also as a podcast where you can stream it on your phone and listen to it in any type of, wherever you are. This is something that's happening in a big way in radio and audio in general, but something that's still slow to take on for WWNO member stations. So it's a big deal for the station, and also it is in a lot of ways pioneering what other NPR affiliate stations around the country are looking to do by having this type of on-demand content that breaks away from traditional news formats. So that's what Tripod is. They're 10-minute, most of the time, 10-minute mini documentaries that each take on a different story within New Orleans history and about New Orleans history. So we have a couple of slides here. There's just the trusty Tripod logo in all its glory. And like I said, this is an example that where if you miss something that happens on air, you can find it online. The explanation here is, as this panel is really about, people talk about New Orleans and New Orleans history all the time. That's not new. And people talking about the city who live here and people talking about the city who don't live here, that's not new. So when we approached the idea, and Molly is the senior advisor of Tripod, that was the first thing that we all said to each other was, how do we acknowledge the fact that New Orleans history is something that's well discussed, and use that to our advantage to carve out new spaces and new narratives. So that was really the charge that we took on when moving forward with the idea. This is also just an example of all the other ways that this is the Tripod on iTunes, which is the way that you can access it as a podcast. This is an image of one of the most recent episodes that we covered. It was about the Industrial Canal here in New Orleans. And I wanted to show this, because I always like to be presenting some of the newest and most fresh material. This is a project that has been going on since 2015. So we've done a lot of stories at this point, and this just came out a couple of months ago. And this is an example of something that people might know about, and not only might people know about it in New Orleans, but they're using it. They're crossing the Industrial Canal. They're looking at the Industrial Canal. It's a part of their life, whether they realize it or not. And maybe they know a little bit about it, but here's an opportunity for us to point out to something that they see all the time, or that they know exists, or they have to commute and cross it. And looking at how it's been discussed in the past, as this, for better or for worse, unbelievable endeavor that was taken on in the early 20th century and was finally completed. It's been really, in my research, looked at as this unbelievable infrastructure feat and triumph, despite pros and cons of what came after. And so what we decided to do was to say, okay, this is something people might know about, But what about all the other things that are never really approached and discussed when talking about this piece of infrastructure that has impacted many, many people over the past 100 years in this city? We also decided to take it on because there's a lot of recent, contemporary, current conversations about the industrial canal and, moving it, expanding it, affecting communities on, both sides again. And so we said, here's something that's in the news, in the local papers today. Why don't we go back and give more context in a way that can help people understand this idea, hopefully in a way that they have never heard before. And then you can just see every audio story, which is about 10 minutes in length, is repurposed into a web article. So if people aren't into radio, A, I'm sorry, and we probably won't be friends, and B, you can still access Tripod. That's really the point, is that we write these as print feature stories so that any way that you prefer to consume the material, it is available to you. And then just finally, this is another episode that we did, again, taking an idea of something that was in the news, which was the removal of 4 Confederate monuments, and saying, what do we do here? We can, talk about the history behind one or all of the monuments that, came down. That's kind of the first obvious thought. And then we thought, well, if that's the obvious thought, we don't want to do that. So what can we do? And we talked about it for a long time, the advisory committee that is integral to every single piece. And we finally decided to come up with an idea to talk about a monument that was never built, that was planned to be built for this man that you're looking at named Oscar James Dunn, that over the course of the end of Reconstruction and moving into the Jim Crow era just kind of dissolved for, intentional reasons and was not there. And we asked the question, what would have happened and what would be different if that monument did exist? So those are the types of ways that you can see how we approach this program. And that's all for now. Thank you. Oh, and actually there's one more that's a collage of, we don't have to talk about that, but the one big thing that we have done so far, again with kind of flipping the script or going into what we hope is uncharted territory, is we, at this past summer, I traveled to Haiti and explored the relationship between Haiti and New Orleans from the Haitian perspective and produced an hour-long special on that relationship. So these are ways that we're trying to, again, go outside the box and bring different ideas and material to the New Orleans community. Thank you.
Morning, Al. I'm Sue Mobley, and as Director of Advocacy for Co-Locate Design, I'm also co-director with Brian Lee of a project called Paper Monuments. We're a public art and public history project with a qualitative participatory element. We're asking New Orleans residents, all of them, what is an appropriate monument to New Orleans today? That's an easy question to ask. It's admittedly a harder question to answer. And answering that question is made a lot harder because it turns out that the firm grasp of New Orleans exceptionalism, 2 centuries of myth-making and nearly a century of marketing, make it hard for anyone to tell stories about New Orleans that aren't part of that frame. So in order to address that, when we started our project, we realized that we wanted to tell some stories that hadn't been told, or that had been told in ways that weren't as complex as the realities they represented. So we began a series of posters as public art, pairing commissioned artwork with rigorously researched narratives. Last June, we reached out to scholars and storytellers who work on New Orleans to ask what person, place, event, or movement is missing from the mainstream narratives of the city. What stories do you want to tell? And the responses were incredible. I've learned a lot doing this project, and I'm going to share a few of my favorite stories with you. Marie Baron et les Fossats. Marie was one of thousands of French criminals shipped to Louisiana in the early 1700s as forced laborers. 18 when she was deported in 1719, her crime was becoming pregnant out of wedlock. with a baby girl she buried soon after landing in Biloxi. Moving to Natchez, Marie married and bore another child. She lost both husband and child in the Natchez Indian Uprising of 1729 and was taken captive herself. Soon after her escape, she moved to New Orleans, where she met and married a soldier, adventurer, and eventually historian and memoirist, Dumont de Montigny, moving into a cottage at Dauphine and Bienville, where they would raise 2 children. The funeral of Andre Caillou. Dr. Powell. On July 29th, 1863, crowds of Black New Orleanians stretched over a mile of Esplanade Avenue to pay their respects to Captain Andre Caillou. A former slave and self-employed cigar maker, Caillou was well respected in the Black community. He helped to found the Friends of Order, a mutual aid society, and was one of the early organizers of the 1st Louisiana Native Guards, the first all-Black Union regiment. Caillou fell on the assault on Port Hudson, where he lay rotting in the sun for 6 weeks as Confederate soldiers took shots at the Union burial details. His body was identified by the Friends of Order ring on the bones of his finger. Abolitionist priest Claude Pachel Maistre conducted the funeral under threat of excommunication by the city's archbishop, who'd forbidden anyone to minister to former slaves. Caillou's hearse was escorted by 2 companies of the 6th Louisiana Colored Regiment and 6 captains of the 2nd Louisiana National Guard served as pallbearers. Their route down Esplanade was accompanied by dirges performed by a white regimental band from Massachusetts. It's worth noting that many of the leaders of New Orleans' Black community after the war, including those who would be elected to municipal and state office during Reconstruction, served in the regiments that made up Caillou's honor guard. Saint Louis La Nuit. Born in West Africa in 1728, Saint Louis survived the Middle Passage and was sold into slavery under a French planter in Algiers. Clever and rebellious in enslavement, Saint Louis was taken to court by his owner for reappropriating livestock and using the proceeds from their sale to sponsor music and food for weekly gatherings at Congo Square. Saint Louis was persistently clever. Working alongside his owner, he helped to make indigo production viable, part of the first cash crop for the struggling colony, and he was freed for his extraordinary service. With his newfound freedom, Saint Louis joined the Compagnie de Mulâtres et Nègres, fighting under Galvez in the Mississippi River campaigns of the American Revolution. He was awarded the Silver Medal of Honor for his valor and a pension for his service. With that pension, he purchased 8 arpents of land along Bayou Road in 1774, which he subdivided, selling lots to free women of color and helping to establish the area that became the neighborhood of Tremé. I know he's been dead for a couple centuries, but I kind of have a history crush on Saint Louis. So we're telling stories in our posters, and they're available at the library and at independent bookstores across town. But sadly, most people don't spend a lot of time in libraries and bookstores. So our posters are also installed across the city in public spaces and helping to define those public spaces as billboards to New Orleans history. We're taking advantage of a lot of boarded up storefronts, a lot of ongoing construction, a lot of neglected spaces. It's a informative graffiti. We also host a series of events. On alternating months, we do Stories at the Crossroads, which is a chance to have oral histories and open mics where everyone can join to tell stories that they feel are missing from the city or important to its future. Storyboards, which lives at the Ace Hotel, is an opportunity to see 2 artists work in 2 hours to create their own paper monuments. It's amazing how many talented visual artists there are in this town. It's amazing what they can crank out in 2 hours. And at the bottom, You can see pictures from an event that we held in partnership with the main library, History Unbound, because so many people were taking proposal forms and saying that they needed to learn more or look things up to make a proposal. We decided that we would create a curated bookshelf and work with librarians to support that research. I've never hosted an event with an age range that wide. The youngest participant was 4, the oldest was 85. They all learned from each other. We learned from all of them, and the librarians were incredible. But the most important part of our project is the public proposals. We've been lucky enough to be able to grow from the work of an organization in Philadelphia called Monuments Lab. They, for the past several years, have had standing installations where they've asked Philadelphians what an appropriate monument is to their city today. It's an entirely different context, and they've been working really closely with us and have been incredibly generous with their time in helping us to figure out how to ask that question here. The responses that they had were incredible. They were epic and intimate. People wanted monuments to the MOVE bombing, but also to Black teachers lifting up students, to the grandmothers who hold churches and neighborhoods together. Our answers are similar, though the removal of the Confederate monuments creates a different context, and I think more pressure for people to feel like they have to give a right answer. We had an 11-year-old suggest an atom for Mid-City as a building block of the whole universe, a giant chess piece for Paul Morphy, a monument to the Latino workers who rebuilt New Orleans after Katrina at Jeff Davison Canal, and trail markers for the slave pens and auction sites across the French Quarter. We've also had a lot of proposals for mules, because a lot of people really like mules, y'all. That's it for now for me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Somali, for getting us all together, and excited to talk to everyone. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. You can or can't? How's that? Okay. I am, compared to both Lane and Sue, and sort of more in process with the project that I'm working on. It's a book project that is part of a series that's coming out from the University of California Press. This is just a shot from the UC Press's series website. And the series is going to be devoted to people's histories of various cities, not only in the US, but across the globe. The first one that's come out already is A People's Guide to Los Angeles. All the other books are still in process. We're about 25% done with our book. So look for us in 2019, although with academic book publishing, you know, where in 2019 that happens. So we're still in the writing process, and have been trying to make the most of the opportunity to figure out how this can be both a book, but also have iterations beyond the print form. But at its basis, the People's Guides are meant to give both an introduction to various sites in whatever the city is. So the first half of the book will be particular locations and sort of short site entries that will give well, that's a map. I'll come back to that in a second, actually. So it'll be a site entry with a short description, and then with some suggestions of places that are nearby, and suggestions for further reading that people might have about that particular site. That's about the first half of the guide. The second half of the guide is going to be suggested tours. And so that's going to be the organization of every single one of the People's Guide series. And so we're still in the process of trying to decide exactly which sites we want to include, and we're pretty certain about the tours that we're going to offer as suggested tours. But the idea is that we're going to include sites inspired by similar kinds of logic and methods of both tripod and paper monuments, include sites that are either generally unknown to the standard tourist narratives and maybe even to New Orleanians who consider themselves pretty expert and well-versed in New Orleans history, or maybe even those who are professional historians, and also to re-signify or to reinscribe our understandings of very popular or well-known already sites that are visited by tourists and by locals. We're thinking about tourism as so central to New Orleans' economy, as people have already pointed out, and that historical tourism tends to drive so much of our tourism. But we understand that so many of those narratives and the stories that are told are those that are the most easily consumed. And so the logic of the People's Guide is to tell histories that may push up against the stories that people want to remember or want to romanticize or to see as kind of nostalgic versions of the city. So we're trying to tell stories that are going to potentially disrupt, and ideally in some ways disrupt, some of the most easily consumed narratives of New Orleans, which might be New Orleans exceptionalism in terms of New Orleans' ability to transcend racial tensions, class tensions, you name it, right? Or its un-Americanness, right? Any of the different things that are associated with New Orleans exceptionalism. So we're going to be trying to choosing sites that do that work, that push up against the some of the most common understandings of the city. And we also understand tourism to not just be about an experience that outsiders have, that people who are living elsewhere have in the city, but one that we're all constantly engaged with, whether or not it's sort of walking past the tour that's happening in the quarter, or whether or not it's dealing with new Airbnb, what do we even call them? Airbnb guests, I guess, in various neighborhoods who are bringing tourists to parts of the city that have normally not been tourist zones. Or if you're someone whose job just involves some aspect of the service industry, we're all connected to tourism in New Orleans in various capacities. So thinking that this is a guide that will have ramifications for locals at lots of different levels. So we're imagining that it could be useful to teachers, to educators, so we're imagining this as that will be part of an educational curriculum ultimately. And we're also thinking about how it could be used as a primary text for community-led events that are about envisioning future imaginings of the city that are people-led. And when we say a people's guide, so we're really thinking about social justice activism very broadly and thinking about resistance very broadly. I like the posters that you brought up, Sue, and lots of the different tripod episodes, that some of the things that are being highlighted are individuals or events that at the time were not necessarily thought of by those people as radical or maybe not even as resistance, but that we understand their contributions in the long run to have disrupted the status quo of the city power networks in a lot of ways. And so we're thinking too that this is a history that's could ideally mobilize future activism in the city. So that's part of it. So one of the things we've had the hardest time with is how to designate different zones within the book. The LA guide I think, had used some LA colloquialisms and just did north, south, east, west. Everybody knows that's not going to work in New Orleans. And so we've talked about organizing it around waterways, sort of upriver, downriver, lakeside, riverside, that sort of thing, and have settled on, for this week anyway, it's going to be settled more permanently in the next couple of months, but some different areas in the city, and we're grouping them we're designating these neighborhoods that will separate parts of the guide, in part based on when they were developed, how they were developed, their relationship, in some ways their relationship to water, to major city thoroughfares, but we're trying to group things in a way that disrupts some of the standard organizings of the city. So for example, we're going to have a neighborhood designation that's the Lower Garden District and Central City put together. And often those are neighborhoods that are seen as so different, in part because of race-class dynamics, and in part because of their relationship to conventional tourist packages and tours that are offered. They're putting those together to put those neighborhoods in conversation with one another and to try to initiate a different kind of tourism, a tourism that we see as ethical, as attentive to the diverse histories of the city. So you'll sort of see, I know it's kind of tough to see this map is in black and white, but you can see that we're grouping, say, we have an area called New City Suburbia that's grouping Lakeview and Gentilly as well as parts of the West Bank, for example. So even though they're not geographically contiguous, that we're thinking about them having some similar developmental histories and thinking about some of the shared histories of resistance that they have, in part because of the time periods in which they were developed. We've got here just a couple of slides that are examples of places that are sites that for sure are going to be highlighted in the guide. This is a building that houses the American Federation of Musicians. So thinking about the unionizing and organizing of musicians in the city so that they would have rights to the royalties and to their music, to copyright, and so much just really crucial history of musicians organizing so that they weren't simply taken advantage of because of their vast talents. And of course, that tended to play out along racial lines and thinking about African-American musicians in the history of the city, particularly being exploited for their the labor that they produced. And this is a picture of the Chinese tomb. And so we're also thinking about a broad multi-ethnic history of New Orleans, which is something that both Tripod and Paper Monuments are very attentive to. So thinking about the history of Chinese immigration to the city in the wake of Reconstruction and thinking about how that changed and shaped the dynamics of New Orleans in ways that we aren't necessarily as visible, especially in the standard tourist zones, because the city has been redeveloped in so many ways. And so the Chinese laundry, Chinese grocery stores, those kinds of things that were located in the French Quarter and the Central Business District are no longer visible, but things like the Chinese tomb and these central cemeteries are. And so what would it be like to go there, to get tourists to go there and to think differently about cemetery history in the city? This is a picture of the Claiborne underpass of the I-10. And so we'll be thinking about places like this where there's all of this public art and murals that have been done to commemorate the long legacy of African American culture, history, and business along that corridor, which was decimated in many ways because of the imposition of the freeway. Elaine also did a story about that too, right? Yeah. So we'll be sort of getting people to go there and to think about the different images that are painted on the murals. And then finally, thinking about a site that is certainly on many tourist maps, which is the statue of Louis Armstrong that is in Armstrong Park. Thinking about the statues in Armstrong Park, which are fairly new, coming in at the end of Nagin's administration and then getting messed up and having to be redone. If anybody followed that whole controversy, like a cement controversy, the cement kept buckling. And interestingly enough, I've heard that Louis Armstrong adamantly said he did not want a statue to himself in Armstrong because he didn't want a place for birds to perch. But nonetheless, there is this statue. And so we know that this is a place that tourists are frequently going to go visit, but how do we understand Louis Armstrong in a different, more nuanced way than is primarily emphasized in the kinds of standard tourist guides or tour experiences? And so in this, the entry that will be for Louis Armstrong, we're going to be thinking about his resistance to racial segregation in New Orleans. We now have, he's come to be repackaged as somebody who is a kind of ambassador of the city. And he, in many ways, completely rejected that and even refused to play in New Orleans for decades. Some of you may know this, but refused to play here because his interracial band was basically seen as criminal under the regulations of Jim Crow segregation. And so we want to both, of course, celebrate his long musical legacy and the sense that he was this kind of humanitarian, a global humanitarian, but to think about the particular resonance of him refusing to be kind of co-opted by the city in a moment where there was so much at stake in resisting racial segregation. And so trying to think about those moments where we can really celebrate his contributions, which in ironically or maybe paradoxically meant that he didn't get to have a relationship to New Orleans for decades because of the policies of the city. But thinking about that as a way that he stood up for New Orleanians and stood up for what he believed in. And so thinking about that as a contribution to the long history of New Orleans, even if paradoxically it meant that he did not have a physical presence in the city during that time period. So thinking about how during that time period he also had, like, there were parks being named after him, and they were like, come back and play for this park, we're renaming it for you in Metairie, and he was like, no, I won't do it. So that's an example of the re-signifying of some of the more standard understandings of the many sites that are part of the sort of tourism mapping. So that's a bit about the People's Guide. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to kind of fuse two questions in one here, but I think it's incredibly important knowing how each of these three projects works, they don't work in the standard way that you think of historians working, which is a lone historian in the library, in the archives. All three of these projects rely on the expertise of historians, but as projects and as sort of public history engines, they work collaboratively. So I'm wondering if you all could talk a bit about how that collaboration works. And in the spirit of public history, I think they work collaboratively on the back end, and also collaboratively on the sort of public-facing side. So I'm wondering if you all could talk a bit about the sort of why that structure works and what the challenges are, particularly in terms of engaging the public in your projects.
Rock, paper, scissors.
I'll start. Well, one thing that immediately comes to mind for me is, this is a collaboration, Tripod is a collaboration between the radio station, the Midlow Center for New Orleans Studies at UNO, and the Historic New Orleans Collection. And it's the first time that I've seen a radio station not just get, sponsorship or funding to do something, but to really be working on the content itself with people that are not radio people. So, the entire first year of Tripod, to be totally honest, and Molly and I have talked about this many times, was a year-long trust-building exercise where I felt in a lot of ways, understandably in some ways, that when I went and met a lot of the historians and scholars to say, hey, I'm Lane, I'm gonna be the producer, they're like, who is this person? And that makes sense because I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD. I'm a radio producer. And so the whole point was that I knew how to do something that they didn't have the skills to do, and they knew a whole lot about a whole lot that I don't know that much about. And if we work together, we can make this product that couldn't be made otherwise. And so that's why I think Tripod has these strengths, because there are different experts that often stick to their own silos, which you see even within a university itself, people sticking to their own departments. Not only was this, one organization coming together to work with another organization, it was people that don't at all do the same thing. And so there was conflict in the beginning. And they had to get to know my personality, which was a little different than their personality. And I remember saying to Molly one day, we had coffee. I'll always remember, we met and had coffee, and I said, Molly, I don't understand. And this is no offense to historians and scholars who I've worked with and love and have grown to see how much similarities there are between radio producers and reporters and journalists and historians and scholars. But I sat down and I said, Molly, I walk into the meeting and say hi to everyone, and no one looks up and no one smiles. What is going on? She was like, that's how they are. I was like, what? And it was tough. And I think what we didn't realize until we could look back was say the whole first year was not only gaining trust from the audience and having the audience say, hey, this is something we want to keep hearing, and this is something we believe you're presenting in a factual, accurate, rigorous way. But it was an entire year for the internal Tripod team to learn to trust each other and work together. And I think that's proof of concept to see a project go for multiple years and not just have this 1 year run, because it takes a year to figure out what to do and how to do it. And I think that I'm so grateful that Tripod is a 3-year project, because now in our 3rd year, you really see the development and the way that something can work, having, worked out all of the complicated dynamics and different backgrounds in the beginning. So that's been a really amazing experience to be a part of.
So I'm looking forward to year 3 now. Paper Monuments has been really lucky in that our sort of core group of people all had a really tight set of relationships to begin with. And so our internal collaboration is tight. It's a couple of my former students, it's my former Vista and one of my dearest friends. And that's fortunate because the larger collaboration is a little bit of a juggling act. We're working to create visuals that involve different scholars suggesting what they want to write about and talk about, and artists either picking or not picking which narratives they want to illustrate, and making sure that everybody is on the same page and producing at about the same time to get things out the door. And we have great partners that are easy. It was a very easy conversation with the Midlow Center to talk about archiving public proposals and all of the other ways in which you all are supporting us. And some of those collaborations are challenging. What does it mean to be in public space offering an open mic when the armed white supremacists show up with the assumption that they won't be allowed to be at that mic? It means that they get to be at that mic because it's a radically democratic process. But the shock on someone's face when they expect resistance and they don't meet it is still a challenge. One of the things we were really excited about when we got a little bit of funding to run this project was the opportunity to run a truly ethical project to show that it could be done. And not just in the sense of telling a genuinely diverse range of stories, but in the pragmatics of producing the things. So making sure that artists get paid so that we're putting money back into the cultural economy, to support local printers and independent bookstores because they're important, to be thoughtful about where things are posted up so that we're not damaging historic buildings, and to make certain that we're getting proposals from a really wide range of people and making clear that it is a radically democratic process, that we do want to hear every voice, and that the mic is always open. So for us, the recent announcement by Mayor Landrieu that paper monuments would be incorporated into the city's process for re-envisioning Lee Circle forced us to re-examine what it meant to collaborate and to be accountable. Because what has been a small, quietly subversive effort to explore new histories, working class histories, Black histories, women's histories, LGBT histories in the city, and to support discourse around the idea of monuments is now very public. So we're recalibrating what it means to collaborate, and asking some hard questions of ourselves. You know, what does it mean to honor the generations of organizing and activism that led to this opening and this opportunity? How do we argue for a diversity of public expressions of history that respect the complexity of this city? How does our process work to serve a city process? And what would the city's process need to look like for there to be not necessarily an outcome that everybody agrees with for one site, but to create a sense of procedural justice, an understanding that everyone has and had a voice in making decisions about what the city looks like, because that's the point of what we're doing. Cities are shaped by the people who live in them. They have to be. In order for a city to be just, we all have to participate in making it. How do we hold that space?
Tall order. We, as Molly mentioned, we have an advisory board for the People's Guide, which was really important to us from the very start to do that.
Is it not on? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we have an advisory board for the People's Guide, and one of the things that was key to us was to honor what we saw as the kind of tourism and tour guiding that was happening in the city that already was speaking to the social justice, cultural memories of the city. So we're thinking about honoring the ongoing work of people like Leon Waters, who has been leading a tour in the French Quarter and also tours around the city as a region that honor the history of slavery as well as resistance to slavery and radical slave revolutions and slave revolts, attempted slave revolts that have been happening. So he's on our advisory board. We also have Frank Perez, who has been doing LGBT history tours in the French Quarter for quite some time. And we also have we have Luisa Dantas, who produced an amazing documentary called Land of Opportunity that is honoring a lot of the different immediate responses to post-Katrina landscape, but among others honoring the work done by Latin American immigrants in the city and their ongoing contributions to the city. That didn't just end after that. So she's sort of the voice who could speak to that history for us. And Kim Bosdeville, who's done great work about among other things, the history of the baby dolls and radical Black women's performance in the streets in New Orleans. And Molly's also on our advisory board. So really trying to get voices who are already doing that work of cultivating, archiving a cultural memory of the city that, again, disrupts many of the standard tourist narratives. We think of the tour guide that's still sort of the Bible of being certified, the beautiful crescent that people have to study and learn when they're becoming tour guides in the city. And we're seeing that as very much as problematic in so many ways. And but that's not the only kind of tourism and tour narratives that have been cultivated. So we really tried to create a group that can help us, inform us of the work that's already being done and how we can best move forward in our program, in our guide to honor that and to sort of take it to the next level. I think the challenge with print and maybe with each of these different forms is that you do sort of have to commit, and you know that in some ways, because history is dynamic, that there's an obsolescence that's built into it and so we also understand that the stories that we're going to tell about the sites, I can't believe you didn't say this thing about this site. And we hope so. We want people to keep telling us, well, this is a story you should have told, and be like, okay, well, then what's going to happen in the next People's Guide? And how can the People's Guide just sort of be a foundation for the beginning of lots of different conversations about different sites in New Orleans, events, histories, and ways of moving in the city, because that's partly what we're thinking about, too, is how to get people to move around and to make connections between different places that may not even be visible on the surface at this point. So we're trying as much as possible to try to bring in lots of voices for how to make some of the choices at this end, but also to understand that this is ongoing and dynamic and developmental, even if we're going to have to commit to some version of a print. Again, it's partly why it takes so much time to do these things, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to pick up on Sue's nodding to the sort of the monument. I'll call it the monument debate. Is that okay? So, because having talked to all three of you, I know that each of you have had interesting responses to not only the citywide sort of moment that happened around these 4 particular monuments, but also how that moment and their removal sort of shapes the way you think about your own projects. Because if you'll remember, early on, when I think before they even came down, the mayor was saying, we can't have these monuments because they don't represent who we are as a city, right? And I read in that both a concern for tourism, right? That tourist narrative that we keep dancing around, which is really hard to grapple with. The tricentennial was also, I think, mentioned in the same breath, right? So there's all this stuff going on, circling around this debate, but even though the debate actually, arguably had its origins somewhere else and is part of a larger public debate across the country. But just in talking to you, I know that you've had some interesting ways of thinking about that moment. So I wonder if you could share those with us. And the legacies of the empty pedestals. Do you want the pointer?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, Stevie, can I have the pointer? Oh, yeah. I'll start again. So I mentioned in my introduction the episode that we took on as the monuments were coming down, and it was a really interesting moment for me too, because I was simultaneously covering the removal of the monuments for NPR, for national NPR. So I was going out and standing and, waiting 8 hours in the middle of the night until, the cranes came and removed Jefferson Davis, and with all, seeing it all happening, not for Tripod, but because I was covering it for national NPR and covering that in a very strict traditional news format where I was, I was running out and doing that, coming back, writing a minute-long rap, sending it to them, and it was airing, 3 hours later, or sometimes an hour later, because the monument was still coming down at 6 a.m. So that was happening on one side of my brain, and then on the other side was what we do here, which is, there's a lot more flexibility with a documentary show where you can say, again, what are we going to do here, and what's the point? Why are we doing this, and what are we trying to have people understand? And like I said before, it became clear that there was plenty coming out in various, online and in print, in local papers, explaining what these monuments were. So we saw that there was already something that was provided to the public to say, this is what the Liberty Monument is, this is why it went up, this is when it went up, okay, we don't need to do that story. This is, who Beauregard is, if you don't know, and this is when this went up, and this is why this went up. And we saw this happening. There were these explainers being done, which were important, so people could really get backstory on what they were, but therefore that was not our job. And so Jessica Dorman from the Historic New Orleans Collection kept kind of mentioning this person, Oscar Dunn, and saying, well, we have a couple people at the HNOC that could really talk about this person. I think that could be really interesting. And I didn't get it at first because I was like, who's Oscar Dunn, which is the point of the story. And how is this about these monuments? And I thought I could just play a 2-minute clip and I'll give a little bit more context on the back end, I think, because this is the first 2 minutes of what is this was a little bit longer, 15-minute episode of this story. So let's just listen to the first 2 minutes, and then we'll be back. Can you hear it?
Yeah, maybe we should pull a mic. That mic's probably not the one to do.
Yeah. I don't know if it's gonna reach.
No, not gonna happen.
Okay.
It's not designed to
Okay.
get
Well,
over there.
okay. I can just explain it, I guess, or just because it is. I think it is too quiet. You all couldn't hear that, right? Okay. So I'm not going to reenact the 2 minutes, even though I probably still have it memorized. But this guy, Brian Mitchell, that's who I was just explaining in the beginning of the piece. He is this example of, in a lot of ways, the perfect person that I'm always looking to try to find and talk to for these tripod episodes. As I jokingly made fun of historians and scholars before, which I seem to always get in trouble doing in the wrong spaces. But you don't only want to have those people on the show because that's not going to be the best way for a listener to connect. That's not going to be, you're always a step away if you're explaining about something that happened that you only know about because you learned it. At the same time, those voices are completely necessary to include in every episode because these are experts on these subjects and they can talk about them at length. They've studied them at length and they really do know what they're talking about. And there's people in this room that have been really important to Tripod, including Pat Brady and Larry Powell over there, who are voices on multiple episodes throughout the series. This guy, Brian Mitchell, is kills multiple birds with one stone because he is a professor. So he works at the University of Arkansas Little Rock where he teaches history. He has a PhD that he got at UNO. He's from New Orleans, and he also happens to be a descendant of this mystery man, Oscar Dunn. So when I found out that Brian Mitchell wrote a 300-page dissertation on his great-great-great-great uncle, I thought there's literally no better person to talk to for this story, because not only is he the expert, this is his family member. This person can talk about this in a really personal, direct way, which is always ideal and which is always going to get at a different point and be able to share a type of human experience that a scholar might not always be able to get at. And case in point, the way that this story opens is that Brian told me he has a strong childhood memory of being in 3rd grade, and he was in his 3rd grade class in New Orleans here, and his 3rd grade teacher was addressing the class, and she said, "Does anyone here know if they're famous to anyone in Louisiana history?" And Brian raised his hand, super excited, and he's 8 years old, and he's raising his hand. And she said, okay, she pointed on Brian and said, okay, who are you related to? And he said, I'm related to Oscar James Dunn. And his teacher said to him, well, who's that? And he said, Oscar James Dunn was the first black lieutenant governor in the country. And she said, and she looked at him and she said, that never happened. And so, to me, that anecdote just does so many things in one, right? It's like, A, you're understanding this person, Brian's experience, being told by his educator in his schoolhouse that his uncle didn't exist, and that there was no black lieutenant governor in Louisiana. So just visibly not only erasing history, erasing his family history in his classroom. And Brian said, the only reason I do know about that is because my family sat us all down all the time and told us about the matriarchs and patriarchs and people in our family. That's how I know. I wouldn't know otherwise, and if I didn't know and I found out some other way, someone would have told me that that wasn't true. And so that was a really powerful moment, listening to Brian talk about that, and as an example of, something that only he could share. And that was, again, just this validation that these are the stories that we need to be telling, because not only are they not being told in other spaces, they're being rejected in other spaces. And so he said, why don't you know about Oscar James Dunn? Because I hardly knew about him and was told not to know about him and not to explore deeper, which of course you can see backfired when he wrote a 300-page dissertation on him and it became his life's work. But, just briefly, this man, Oscar James Dunn, was born enslaved, and he was freed at the age of 11. He went to school, he went into politics, and he rose to be the first black lieutenant governor. That is true. And there are a lot of rumors and reason to believe he was on his way to potentially become the vice president of the country under Ulysses S. Grant, and he very suddenly died. At a dinner, and mysteriously, and the episode goes into this, but 99% of people at this point can safely say he was poisoned and he was killed. When he was killed, there were a lot of people that directly went to say, we need a monument for this person in that moment, not even later. And over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, that monument disappeared, didn't happen. And then you get the Liberty Monument, and then you get the Beauregard Monument, and then you get the Jefferson Davis Monument. So that's how we decided to go with what was happening here, which was a national story, and to try to take this hyper-local and yet national viewpoint from a very, very personal perspective.
Good narration.
I'm kind of writing the manuscript for the alternate history in which he isn't assassinated.
I know.
Because I feel like that story wants to be developed.
It's like the opposite of the plot against America.
Right. So I think most of our team was involved one way or another with some of the organizing with Take 'Em Down, NOLA. And some of the things that we've used in Paper Monuments, some of the ideas about display came out of a projection that Brian Lee, my co-director, did way back 3 years ago, projecting alternate stories onto the then Lee Monument with Take 'Em Down. And I'm buried in sort of whatever's going on in the streets of New Orleans at a given moment, trying to help wrangle people and keep folks safe, because if folks are going to be out in the street, I'm going to be out there trying to keep them safe. But our project really got started at the Beauregard takedown, which was, in fact, until 6. Why? It was so long. So long. Such a large statue, so long. And because Brian and I are incredibly snarky human beings, we started from a premise of wanting to intervene in the what was happening that evening. I'd said that I wanted to print large cards like they have at weddings, because the police barricades had separated combating parties. And on one side of the barricades, there were a bunch of angry people with flags and guns who were getting angrier over the course of the night. And on the other side, people were sharing snacks and had brought out their kids and their dogs, were passing around drinks and making friends with their neighbors, and then a brass band showed up. And so really, we were having a party, and I thought, maybe if we made big cards at the back, so that when you're walking up, you could see right side of history and wrong side of history. That'd be fun. And then Brian, who's even snarkier than I am, but less organized, suggested that we should, for Lee, have really tiny violins to hand out so that people could play the world's smallest violin. And because I am the organized one of us, I got online and looked up bulk mini violin prices, set up a GoFundMe, raised $500, and had 23 people sign up for it. 10 minutes later. Turns out, actually, that it's really quite hard to get tiny violins rush shipped from China. Just like in case you ever need to know that. Would have taken 2 weeks, we had 3 days. But we were really fortunate in that, we were out at the daytime takedown of Lee, which was a really lovely celebration. And it was kind of amazing to see how much the tone changes when you're doing something in the light of day rather than trying to do it at night. That we had a DJ out and people doing line dancing and the electric slide, jumping double dutch, which is also harder than it looks. And kids playing. And I think we drank the gas station out of champagne, which raises the question of why gas stations would carry champagne. That's how it goes. So much of our project is embedded in the monuments debate, in the moment where we left Lee and got on a plane and went to a conference called Design Futures, where people who work in public space and urbanism, architecture, and design across the country come together with a bunch of students for 5 days on a college campus and lock down. And all anybody wanted to talk about was what was happening in New Orleans, what was happening across the country, and what was next. And so, when you get the chance to lock down with the best minds on a subject for a few days, you come up with some pretty good ideas. But in that, there was this moment where 30 of us had sent an article from City Lab around to each other about the Monuments Lab project in Philadelphia. Nobody had read it because we'd all just forwarded it and said, hey, look at this, I'll read it later. We finally sat down at a table at lunch to talk about some of the ideas that had come up for a Compass Rose at Beauregard, or a indentation into the earth at Jeff Davis, representing a true absence. And someone asked, has anybody actually read the article that keeps circulating around? And one person had, and so they tried to summarize it for us. And as we were having that conversation, a friend walked up and said, hey, I heard you guys were talking about monuments, and I'm on the board of directors for an organization in Philadelphia called Monument Lab. And I think you should talk to them. Our project has been just a series of strange coincidences and a ton of serendipity, but it's all taken place within the context of this removal of this space and of these conversations that have started and that we hope to continue, because they're important conversations. They're conversations about how we view ourselves, how we remember history, what stories we tell, how we experience public space differently than one another, what the ties are between symbols and systems, what kind of world we want to live in going forward, what kind of injustices we need to atone for, whether Mitch will make a successful 2020 presidential bid. Lingering shadows.
I think it's still sort of remains to be seen what exactly our entry will be regarding the site of the now former monuments. But one thing we've been talking about is wanting to honor the fact that the monuments coming down is the product of decades of organizing, decades. And so thinking about people on our advisory board like Leon Waters, who have been saying these monuments, as well as, of course, street names, the kinds of honoring and the kinds of prominence, you know, the pedestals and the things you look up to literally are crucial to how we understand ourselves and to the kind of political, economic and social realities that play out on the ground level. And so I know that for sure the story we want to tell is the story of organizing that really crystallizes in the 80s and 90s, and thinking about how that overlapped with the organizing that was happening against the exclusionary white supremacist Mardi Gras crews and who were parading at the time. And so thinking about that moment. So a lot of what the People's Guide wants to do is to try to say, okay, yes, we could say that Take 'Em Down NOLA was this new and like youth-led in some ways, but also intergenerational, and that people sort of tell the story of, well, the monuments came down because Bree Newsom took down the Confederate flag in Charleston. This is in response to the Dylan Roof's murder of so many African Americans in their church in Charleston. And yes, all of that is part of the moment, and there's a larger conversation that got sparked around the Confederate monuments in the last couple of years, but this is part of an ongoing conversation that is the work of tireless activists who in some ways might be uncelebrated. So wanting our guide to point to some of these earlier moments that acknowledge the long history.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Yes, over there, thank you.
Speaking of the common narrative of New Orleans, I have a history, master's in history from Loyola, and I'm New Orleans native as well. Speaking of the common narrative of the history of New Orleans, you look at a lot of this comes from the Peggy Scott LaVoy documentaries and the one public television station that we have in New Orleans, where that's where most of the history that a lot of common people get the story from. And it's very one-dimensional. It's very saccharine. It's very whitewashed. And, you know, and when you look talk about the issue of, I personally think that maybe the Mardi Gras crews are more racist and more legacy of the Confederacy than even the monuments were. But yet the Channel 12 celebrates them every Mardi Gras night with a meeting of the court. So if you could speak about that and talk about how the main public television station presents a history that is very, very one-dimensional and doesn't reflect on these other issues.
Lane?
It's electronic
I'll
media.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And I this not to hate on WYES, because that's not the point, but I will say that one of the very first conversations that we had when we were embarking on producing this 3-year-long series was to not do that. And that means to not say, we're going to have this tricentennial project, this thing, which when I came on board, it wasn't designed yet. So we knew we were doing something. We didn't know how it was going to go. We didn't know if the segments were going to be 5 minutes long, if we didn't know if it was going to be this, longer project that we could, push to be 12 minutes and still maintain that morning drive time, 8:30 a.m. audience, captive audience, which is a benefit of being on the radio. But one thing we knew we weren't going to do was to do a 1 or 2 hour chronological sweep of New Orleans history, because you cannot do that well. And even, we were joking about this when we all met, even when Ken Burns does a 10-hour version of it, he's missing a lot. And it's within a certain framework, and you only get one shot. Because you spend all these months behind the scenes making this thing, and then you put it out, and you're done. So all the things you did wrong, too bad, you did it wrong. And so we said, you know, we're gonna try to do that, the exact opposite of that in as many ways possible, and start early so that we have 3 years to cover a whole bunch of stuff, and to do one mini story after another mini story after another mini story where we could do something and someone could give us feedback and we can incorporate that into the next episode. Another thing that we decided we weren't going to do, even if it wasn't going to be a 1 to 2 hour, you know, long PBS style documentary, was that we weren't going to go in chronological order at all. And that was something, again, all of these were conversations that we had and decisions that we made. A lot of Tripod can seem a little bit, if you look back at the archive, it can seem semi-haphazard because no, we don't go across a timeline. We're not saying we're going to take on this category and only talk about, you know, politics for a month. Because that would completely disbar us from addressing and responding to things that are happening in real time here and taking a historical slant. So when the monuments were coming down, if we said, if it was May of 2017, and we said, oh damn, we really should do something on Oscar Dunn, but we promised that we were gonna be talking about, you know, the opera. What's, you know, what good is that to public media if you're so rigid in these decisions that you can't, you know, have the agility to say, actually, we're gonna pause from the plan, which no one knows about except for us, and we're gonna go do this thing that makes a lot more sense to do right now. So yeah, we kind of looked at that and looked at what it does accomplish and what it doesn't accomplish, and decided and created our design based off of that.
So briefly.
I want to take a second to just honor the haphazard, because I think that one of the things that's been sort of lovely about the tricentennial being as loosely organized as only New Orleans can bring to what should be a large event is that, unlike, say, the Katrina at 10 celebration, I was calling it Katrina Palooza for a while, which was very tightly organized and which had a primary narrative that was saccharine and sentimental and heroic and often gross, frankly. One of the things that's happened with the tricentennial is that because there has been so much space left open for people to shape things in ways that aren't top-down, that aren't orchestrated, that aren't part of that narrative, is that those opportunities have been taken. And there are a ton of projects right now, formal and informal, scholarly and very public and ad hoc, that are claiming different narratives and different ways of representing the city and really running with it. So it's an exciting time, I think, for all of us to be part of something very, very big that isn't something state-sponsored.
Do you want to say something? We kind of are, but go ahead.
Okay. I'll be brief, but I think part of the excitement I have about everybody on this panel is the fact that we're engaging in different types of media. And so understanding television as a primary media, but it's never been the end-all be-all of how people are consuming this kind of historical narrative. Certainly has a lot of reach, as you're saying, and a lot of currency. But I think we're trying to figure out ways in which we can use different media forms, and how even maybe seemingly the poster is one form, but how it, once it's on a building, it takes on a different identity, you know. And as you're saying, once there's, you know, you hear it on the radio, but then if people can go then teach your podcast in the classroom and can choose which ones of these stories they want to put together and create their own narratives. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do too. So the disruptive, the haphazard, but that where people can create logics that are innovative of their own. So really thinking about audience as something that's a participatory audience, and that it isn't completely predictable, you know? So I mean, I think to me, the totalizing narrative is always gonna be a failed narrative. As soon as you're like, this is the history of New Orleans, right? Then it's probably gonna be deeply, deeply flawed. And so I think part of what we're trying to say is that we're trying to get as many stories as possible, and to have people make the connections that are meaningful for them between the different stories. on their own or collectively in groups, whether that's groups, classrooms that are sitting and talking about these things. What does it mean to put Oscar done? Yeah. In conversation with the industrial canal. How are those things actually related? And so I know part of the People's Guide project, too, just thinking about the tricentennial, is to harken back to a pre-colonial history of the city. And so to try to tell Indigenous history with the limitations and constraints that we have around that, but try to have a layered understanding of New Orleans history that predates the colonial understandings, too, which is challenging for a tour guide, given that so many of these sites are not going to be able to be experienced in anything close to the ways they were, certainly 300 years ago or more. But we're thinking like the presence of shells in the city, harkens back to the shell middens that Indigenous tribes used to deal with floods and to have settlements. And so how can we, even if we just see the shells that then got harvested for concrete, how can we harken back to histories that are not told, haven't been told in the standard public history narratives?
Maybe one more question. I'm cheating here. Go ahead.
Wonderful work you're all doing here. Just a question. Are there any sort of project or plans to have sort of a multimedia sort of museum celebrating the contributions of women, and particularly sort of, you talk about pre-colonial, like Native American women, and just curious.
Well, I do know that NOLA for Women has sponsored a project. The name is escaping me. Do you know the title of it? Where they invited various organizations around town to put on their own exhibits related to women in New Orleans for the tricentennial. So that's taken a lot of different forms. But if you go to NOLA for Women's website, I think you'll see a list there of the various venues. And I think the point of that was to try to reach as many different audiences as possible. So I think the Historic New Orleans Collection did something, but then I think much smaller organizations have also had their own exhibits. But I guess true to the disorganization of the New Orleans sort of ethos generally, I don't know what the calendar, that calendar was kind of wobbly, and it happened at all different places and spaces. So I would like to see something like that more promoted more and more available to people, a calendar of events and things. Okay, thank you. Thanks, you guys. I'm sorry.